Welcome everyone, thanks for coming. This is The Strange Death of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or Why Cartridge Collecting is Revisionist History. The initial title was Why Cartridge Collectors Are Boring People, but I'm Frank Cifaldi. I Google image searched the name of my nonprofit and found this horrible screen cap of me, and now I'm sharing it with you. I run a nonprofit organization that we founded 2 years ago, maybe 3, called the Videogame History Foundation. Short version of what we do is we want to make sure that historians have the tools that they need to tell the story of video game history. The sort of ultimate goal of that is some notion of a digital library, but baby steps, we're getting there. We're actually opening a physical library this year, so look forward to that in California. All right, you guys know what this thing is? Yeah. All right, this debuted over 35 years ago. This is the family computer from Nintendo. This was basically a system that was built to bring their arcade games, mostly Donkey Kong, into homes, and it was, it was the #1 console in Japan. It was a cool thing. We're going to go through its history very, very quickly here. The first time that the Famicom technology sort of started getting outside of Japan was actually in the arcades. So in 1984, Nintendo of America, all like 8 employees back then, started introducing the Versus system, which was basically an arcade system with the Famicom embedded inside of it. And in fact, they even started sort of like altering the hardware a little bit. Versus Balloon Fight on the right, totally underrated if you haven't played it. So the Versus dual system games like that, there were 2 screens, 2 different players would see their own perspectives. And so Versus Balloon Fight is actually a double tall field for Balloon Fight, and it tracks your position on the screen depending on which side you're on, which is pretty cool. Of course, they tried to bring the Famicom home in America. They tried for a minute with this thing called the AVS. They tried to go this sort of like high-tech consumer electronics route, but that didn't really work out for them. No one was really super interested in that. I see some confused looks in the crowd that have never seen this. That's great. Yeah, this was, okay, so CES 85, this is what they bring out. The video game industry's dead. They're like, hey, do you want to sell this ridiculously expensive thing with like 12 components and a keyboard, and also a keyboard, 2 kinds of keyboards, and wireless controllers, and that probably don't work because it's 1985. Didn't work out, so they kind of went back to the drawing board and came back with this thing. This is the Nintendo Entertainment System. Hooray, yay. Everything went great. A huge explosion in America, millions of people owned it, almost single-handedly saved the video game industry in the United States. Hooray, hooray, Nintendo. As the Nintendo is sort of exploding here and sort of spreading to places like Europe, there's some countries where Nintendo doesn't sell the thing, pretty much because there's so much piracy already happening with the Famicom that it's not worth it. So in some places, like in Brazil, you might play the Phantom system, which was, if you look at it, the shell, I love this. The shell is an Atari 7800. The controllers are a Sega Genesis, and the internals are an NES. And if you grew up in Russia or some other former Soviet places, you played with the Dendy. And just quick side note that I find interesting that I don't think many people realize. The official Phantom games, they're not licensed by Nintendo, but they're not pirated. So, like Activision, for example, licensed Ghostbusters 2 to Gradiente in Brazil, and that's an official, not bootleg Ghostbusters 2. It's just not approved by Nintendo. I think it's kind of a weird, interesting footnote. So, twilight years of the NES, 95, death comes to us all, even if we're computers, and in most of the world, we've sort of moved on to things like the PlayStation. But, in those other parts of the world, they don't have the PlayStation necessarily. They might have something like the Polystation. And the Polystation is another one of these sort of cloned Famicoms. Famiclones, as we like to call them, had sort of been around since I think like the late 80s. But they just kind of kept getting refined down until they were sort of like these small one-chip things. And so, like, you know, it's 95 through like early 2000s in places like Brazil and Russia and China. You know, they're happy to play pirated bootleg versions of the games that we all played, but that's not going to last forever. So, you know, software support continued on for the NES. And I'm just going to play a brief video of highlights of some of the more interesting games that were coming out for the cloned Famicoms in other parts of the world. So as you can see, a lot of them might use, you know, IP that they don't necessarily own the rights to. This is a version of Capcom's Aladdin, not the Sega one. I'm just going to shut up because these are funny. Flighty chicken rules. Yeah, I could play that sound forever. Yeah, so did anyone here go to Rachel's talk yesterday about homebrew by chance? Yeah, a few of you did. So something Rachel brought up Rachel, is Rachel in the room? Rude. So something Rachel brought up is that you know, we tend to label these games as like bootleg games, which I think is sort of dismissive of them. I think they're actually kind of cool, like, and I think it's a little bit even xenophobic to dismiss these games as like bootleggy things that don't count, that aren't real, because it's just not, you know, culturally things are different, you know, in places like Russia and China, where IP law doesn't matter, so why wouldn't you make Pokemon for the console that everyone is playing? I don't know, if you define artistic merit based on what corporations are cool with, you're kind of a cop. Oh, I don't know if you guys could see the tagline of the Poly Station. It's just not a game anymore. So the sort of, refined Famicom tech, like I said, at this point it's like on a chip and it costs like pennies. And so in China, this new market sort of emerges where the default tech for like toy computers is an NES, like straight up an NES. And so you start getting things like this where you have like typing tutors that run on the NES. Like for some reason, some of them have like Windows 98 boot screen when you start it. With that. But like, in China they've been cloning the Famicom for so long that they could just, poop these things out. There's a whole market, the whole industry for this sort of product. So this is not Famicom, but meanwhile here in America, early 2000s, this sort of plug-and-play market starts emerging. Literally the only reason I chose this one is because of how funny that joystick looks. So like there's sort of a new toy category, this notion of plug-and-play, right? You guys have probably seen stuff like this before, right? There's all kinds of, there's like one where it's like a SpongeBob one and you control his nose. And there's like Star Wars and WALL-E. I think there's a Shrek one. So if you're a company like Jack's Pacific, which made this, you use, it's cheap. It's really, really cheap tech actually that could produce, vaguely sort of like maybe Sega Genesis-ish looking games, not related hardware-wise at all, but that's sort of the look you get. But if you're more maybe like financially conservative, let's say like these guys, instead of the really cheap tech, you go for the really, really cheap tech. And what's the really, really cheap tech in China for toy computers? It's the Famicom. And then a really cool thing happens here in America. In 2003, most of the patents, the hardware patents, expire on the Famicom. And so now companies can actually like make new NES consoles. They can't call it Nintendo or anything, but they can make consoles that are essentially, the NES guts and start selling them to people. So this is a really, really early example. This is the earliest one I could find. This is the TV. Oh, that's not what the colors look like. There we go. So you guys might have seen plug-and-plays like this where it's just super, super generic, like non-games. Like they sort of resemble things that are video game-like and have things like scores, but don't have things like game design. And so this, I believe, is maybe the earliest work of a company in China called Nice Code, which I love that name also for this. Nice Code, man. And you go through this, they're all like super generic like this. There's no music, there's hardly any sound. It reminds me of like the early days of homebrew on the system where people are just sort of starting to figure out how the thing works because there's no official documentation and they're just kind of poking and prodding at it. This boxing game is ridiculous. That Snake, you put Snake on anything, right? I think this is probably the best game on here where you're a caveman throwing something at mice because you don't want them to go in those holes. Oh, and also you don't want to get that snowflake, it slows you down. But that sort of spawns its own like history that there's the patent of that slide was out of order, or I would have talked about that. And this was the system we just looked at. But that sort of spawns, the kind of things you guys have probably seen like at Walgreens and shit like that, right? Where it's like, there's 140 games that you definitely don't want to play. But they're all in here. And they still sell this stuff. Like these same games, you see them all the time. And it's like, there's this, there's like 2 or 3 studios in China. Some of them are made up of like people who were working on those cartridge games that I just showed you. Like they just kept making NES games. So a lot of this tech is pure NES, but also the tech sort of started evolving as well. And you'll see, not just cloned Famicoms, but you'll see cloned Famicoms where they like gave it new sound or like upped the color on it so they could display more on screen. And I could talk about that stuff forever, but what I really want to talk about here, which I find really interesting, is that because the patent's expired and because American companies, they want to put things on toy shelves that people will recognize and buy, you start seeing a lot of like brand new NES games that are like branded with IP that you know. Well, and here's an example, right? This is an NES that Polaroid made. Like it's a branded NES with crappy games built in that Polaroid made, and it's specifically Polaroid did it because it was meant to be part of their like in-car entertainment systems. You'd plug this in the SUV to shut your kids up while you're driving. But I think more interestingly is that these companies in China started making officially branded games for the NES for this market. So like one really popular genre was these plug-and-play card games, and like anyone who made cards had one of these. There's Bicycle, there's Bee, there's Hoyle on the right, and I have a couple examples of these I can show. Again, these are straight up NES games. Like you could theoretically get the ROMs off of this thing and like put them on a cartridge and it runs on your Nintendo. I love this creepy dealer, his eyes. I think you're like, I don't know, like I don't trust this. There's some kind of bargain with the devil happening here, I'm pretty sure. But super simple games, slots. Again, they don't really have like great sound. I think for this one they even stole Konami's sound driver, if I'm not mistaken. But this was, I think that was Bees. I think this is Hoyles. It's like, no, Bicycle, sorry. You see Bicycle in the background. This one is Hoyle. Like it's the same menu and everything. Like they just kept repurposing but also building on the games over and over again to just get these products out. And there's nothing like, I mean, there's some fun art, They do some cool things, like, I don't know if you just saw the computer opponent here, was sort of talking. I think this is War, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I think it's War. She sort of talks when it's like, whoa, that was close. There's some heart put into these. I don't know if you just saw that. I'll take those. And there's the same characters. Old Maid has some fun art. Like they were trying, but like it's just cheap fun toys. Sudoku, popular category of Famiclone in the mid 2000s. There's a bunch of these. My favorite is the New York Times official Nintendo Entertainment System. This notice puzzles selected by Will Shorts. So like, if you guys listen to NPR, that's like the Puzzle Master on Weekend Edition. Like he can claim to have designed an NES game. I have this one too, if you guys want to see it. Hang on. I'm going to skip ahead to me being awesome at Sudoku because I made a website generator show me all the answers for this. Also, it is the hardest one on here. It's expert level 185, but woohoo! I won. And actually, what I find really interesting about this one, so notice there's like a number pad on here. The way they accomplished those extra buttons was that all of these buttons here you have two controllers worth of inputs on an NES, so they basically mapped inputs from both controllers to all these buttons. So like, if you press 9, that might be like controller 2 right or something. I thought that was kind of a neat, innovative way of adding a number pad to an NES. Casino was another really popular category. Look at this branding here, right? Like World Series of Poker did an NES. Golden Nugget Casino, that was from Majesco. I can show a little bit of that too. there's like some attempt at something like music in here, which is nice, you know. Skip around. I don't know if you can hear that hum, right? That is because the hardware on all of these is just garbage. Like, it's just, the wiring is terrible, and like this is the best I can do. Like even the video is very noisy. You get the idea. Oh, we're not there yet. Kids Market, right? Crayola, Sesame Street. Like these are branded systems that have NES ROMs on them, and something I really like is sort of the design that you get on the physical controllers of these, right? Like you don't really tend to see video game systems that look like this because they're made for people who play, real video games. But if you're, if you just have an embedded computer system and you're making a kid's Sesame Street thing, why not just have left, right, and a giant button to mash, right? Crayola, I think, is really cool. It's the shape of like a box of crayons. And the software on that, again, very terrible wiring in these things. Super simple, just coloring book stuff. If you guys ever heard of Color a Dinosaur? Yeah, it's like the same game, but Crayola branded. I'm tempted to let this run and just let you guys critique my art. So you could just, you color. You could do this really hard sliding puzzle. And okay, connect the dots is move the thing to the dot and press the button, and it connects the next dot. I hope I can solve this. And once you've solved it, you can color it. And then, do I have Sesame Street on here? I do! These games are like insulting and how stupid they are. Like, no kid is this dumb. I like the animations in here though. They tried. Oh my god. I believe you play as Elmo, the goalie here. Yeah, you bounce between the three spots. Stop the ball. Okay, this one. You're going through the entire alphabet. Here comes G. You can get the fish for bone. Okay, here comes H. Remember, there's no up or down. And then this is sort of like a shape matching game. As you can see, I'm not very smart. What's gonna happen when I build this house? Thanks for the one clap. The singular clap. And then I think there's one more game on here. So let's just wait for that shape and press a button. Oh god, he fell into the void! Elmo. This is the official American Idol for the Nintendo Entertainment System. So you might have seen, like, I think it was called Hot Dance 2000 in a video before. This was actually a whole category of these Famiclones, was the dance pad, because it's the mid-2000s. People like that now. I didn't record a video of this in time, unfortunately. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. What I find most interesting, though, is it's not just, everyday lifestyle brands or whatever that are getting into this. Like, actual video game companies are sort of getting on this too, including Konami. So this is a Konami, the Konami Collector's Series Arcade Advance, which was put out by Majesco in, I think, 2004. And it has 3 classic Konami NES games. It has, I think, Gyrus, Yair Kung Fu, and Russian Attack. but then it also has brand new Konami games for the NES. Like Scramble for the NES came out in 2004, 2005, something like that. I don't know where the 2002 copyright comes from, honestly, because it wasn't out then. You know, if you've ever played Scramble, this is Scramble. It even has like Contra's sounds because it's Konami's stuff. Like I don't think Konami's in-house. You know, I don't think people at Konami made this. I'm pretty sure this was farmed out to one of the 2 or 3 Chinese developers that were making this stuff at the time. But you know, this is an officially sanctioned brand new Konami game in 2004. Hang on, I beat it. Here we go, hang on. If you've never played Scramble, you have to position your ship just right at the end here to like bomb this thing. Oh, missed it, come on. You fly by all 6 Konami headquarters. Yeah! Time Pilot rules if you've never played Time Pilot. Like, these are very convincing to me. Like, if you told me that these were Famicom games that Konami had made in the early 80s, I would believe you, if I didn't already know better. Time Pilot, I think I went through 3 stages. Oh, I think I go through the menu on this one so you can see the menu. Modern Konami logo on an NES. God, this music drives me crazy. Yeah, Frogger for the NES came out in 2005. Like, they had this at E3. Like, I looked up a map, they were next to Square Enix. So, like, Square Enix had Final Fantasy 12 for the PS2, and then the next booth over, you could play Frogger on the NES. But I mean, you know, no one was calling it the NES, right? Well, first of all, because legally you couldn't. But second, you know, they were trying to hide that, right? It's an arcade system with the real arcade game inside of it. With those terrible, like, bootleg multi-cart menu sounds when he jumps, I hate that. So, you know, it's feature-rich, right? Like, you go through the levels and you get, like, the weird crocodile log and whatever is it like a mole or something? It's like, I never knew. Well, there's a snake, too, also, yeah. What I think is the most funny, though, is that Atari, Intellivision, and Coleco all had Famicoms in this era. So, like, all 3 of the major consoles here from before the NES made an NES. And this is something I think just is lost history that people don't realize. That, like, people were commissioned to port Atari 2600 games to the NES in the mid-2000s. Intellivision also, Coleco. Well, Coleco not so much. Coleco, I won't go into the history of Coleco, but it's just a name that means nothing at this point. They put their name on literally anything. There was a Coleco actually handheld that had Game Gear games. So this is just like really terrible games that have nothing to do with Coleco's stuff. Vaguely sort of based on their old like LED games from the early 80s. I can show you some of the Atari stuff if you guys are interested. So you guys know Adventure? Like they're totally competent versions of these games. Actually, Adventure's short enough. I'm just gonna let this run. Kill the duck. Kill that other duck. Get the key. So we don't know exactly who programmed these games, which is also kind of concerning, like historically. We believe it was Nice Code in China, but it's not been confirmed. Come on, get in there. Come on, you guys don't know Adventure? You don't play this every day and force it on your kids like the weirdos on the phone?
This is how you open the door.
So on this one, like the collision's a little bit weird, which is why I had to kind of drop the key to get in the door, because it didn't quite recognize it yet. Bye, dead duck. Yeah!
Does that version have the glitch?
The question was, does the version have the glitch, meaning the Easter egg? You know what, I haven't tried, but I bet it does, because I know that the person overseeing this project was Kurt Vendel, who runs Atari Museum. Actually, I should specify, it was only the first version of the Atari Flashback that is an NES. The next year, he actually had time to work on something, and then it cloned the actual Atari 2600, and you could even like slot a cartridge port on it, which I thought was pretty cool. So Asteroids is actually based on the 7800 version. Oh, that's a two-player version. No one wants to watch Breakout ever. Yeah, Centipede's on here. The really terrible version of Crystal Castles for the 2600 is just somehow even worse. Desert Falcon, which is sort of their weird like shooter where you're a falcon, and I think that's supposed to be a joke because it's called Desert Falcon. I don't know. Food Fight, which is a game I actually kind of like. Do you guys know this one? Yeah, baby, eat that food. I was going to show you this one because I brought it, but then I had tech difficulties. Just imagine, it's really cool. But I wanted to highlight this one in particular because I find it really fascinating. So if we go back to this slide right in the middle, the Intellivision 25, that was sort of their first plug and play. They kind of revised it like a year or two later. And this one actually seems to be kind of rare. Like I had a really hard time getting one. And what's really interesting to me about this one is that it contains sequels to they're fake Intellivision games, but they made like fake Intellivision sequels to their fake Intellivision games. So there's like Astro Smash 2 is on here. It's Astro Smash with power-ups. It's kind of cool, and like I wish I could show you. There's also a game on here called Long Drive Golf, which was never an Intellivision game, so it's a brand new fake Intellivision game on the NES, which is bizarre. I discovered this literally, like I'm still finding stuff. This stuff is so undocumented that I'm still figuring this out. Like the day before I flew for MAGFest, I discovered that there's a plug and play that has Snood for the NES on it, along with some really bad Speed Racer like ROM hacks that are official, but are they're not like new games. It's like they took their crappy racing games and then put that. I don't know how if you could see how poorly drawn Speed is on there, but kind of just added those title screens to their bad ROMs. Yeah, they're Snood on the NES. I found a screen cap online. So, as the sort of commercial plug-and-play market is sort of drying up for these developers in China, a whole new market starts emerging here in America and a little bit in Japan also, where homebrew developers have gotten to the point where we have tools for building these games that are reasonable, and we have people who are actually manufacturing new parts. And there's sort of this new commercial industry that emerges around like 2007 of brand new games for the NES actually on cartridge. And what I find really fascinating about this whole thing is that since the Famicom came out in 1983, 35 years ago, there hasn't been a year without new commercial software written for that platform. I think that perhaps that's only true of the NES and might technically be true of like, I don't know, IBM computers, if you consider, no, I wouldn't consider that because it's moving on Windows, maybe Commodore 64, like maybe there was enough of a homebrew scene commercially, I don't know. But I think this might be it's definitely a fairly unique situation because you think about it, where because it was cloned in China and because it didn't release new systems in parts of the world, that sort of had this weird aftermarket in the twilight years of unofficial games. And then like the patent expiration happens right when that's drying up, and then right when the plug and play market's sort of drying up, homebrew starts, and I don't think there's really an end in sight for that yet. It even had this effect that I didn't anticipate at all, where people who were licensed game creators back in the day for Nintendo were starting to release new NES cartridges, like officially. Capcom just reissued Mega Man 2 in like a collector's edition. A company took a game that was only ever released in Japan, Holy Diver, and like made an NES cartridge out of it. Data East has like a 5-in-1 thing. You guys know Dizzy the Egg? It was I saw some nods. Dizzy the Egg is a platformer in the UK from Codemasters, and the Oliver twins, I swear to God, every time they go in their attic, they find a new Dizzy game that they like wrote back in the day but never published. They're on their 4th unreleased NES Dizzy game that they're making a cartridge for. It's not over. Like, even the plug and play thing's not over. This thing came out about 6 months ago from Go Retro. This is the Go Retro Portable. I don't know if you can see what's on screen there. That is Tetris. That is, in fact, a brand new version of Tetris for the NES released in 2018 by Go Retro. And it's not bad. But I skip ahead to me losing. So you can see it has some modern conveniences, not all of them, right? But it has the sort of counter, shows you what's next. It has the ghosting, which I think is cool. It has the up for auto drop.
Smooth scrolling.
Yeah, the smooth scrolling as well, yeah. So like the point being that the Family clone is still a viable piece of tech that's in use right now. I forgot to include it, but I took a photo at Office Max like 2 weeks ago, and they had an aisle of like plug and play consoles, and half of them are literally an NES with some ROMs built into them. If you've ever seen there's even new ROM hacks, like MSI Entertainment has a plug and play that's like a WWE wrestling game. That's a ROM hack of an old WWF wrestling game, and they like replaced 2 of the wrestlers and like drew the new faces and stuff. Like, it's still happening. People often ask me like, oh, are these ROMs on the internet? Can I download them? Can we dump them? Can we preserve them? The answer is technically, but you have to do shit like this, which no one wants to do. So I don't know if you can see you can see my cursor sort of. Like here, that is the embedded system with the ROM data, right? And this is just a big blob of epoxy that is covering this ROM, because that's just a cheap manufacturing process where you don't have to solder the ROM in. You just kind of pop it in the board and put this epoxy in and it's golden. You can't take that epoxy off. You can't maybe theoretically you could find some chemical composition to melt it down, I don't know, but no one's really figured that out as far as I know. The only way to get at this data is to trace the lines and try to read it off. And this was actually, this was sent to me by Brian Parker, who goes by Bunny Boy. He runs retrousb.com, if you guys know that. And what he had to do to try to read this stuff off of it, he was just experimenting, was to wire all of that to an NES cartridge connector and then use an NES dumper to get the ROMs off of it. And he's like, yeah, never again. Never doing that again. So I think, people ask me about this a lot. I'm never going to do this. But the reason that I've been I've been tweeting about this stuff a lot lately too, because it fascinates me, but a lot of the reason that I'm talking about this now is because I don't think people are aware that there's all these weird NES games that are just kind of stuck in these hunks of plastic, and maybe someone does want to do this and doesn't realize that there's cool stuff that they could be extracting the data from. So that's why we're talking about this. A lot of my research actually started, a lot of my fascination, I should say, with this actually came from these really cool guys at the Bootleg Games Wiki. So if you guys are interested in this stuff, you should check this out. These guys are hyper obsessed with unofficial console games, and they've been documenting this stuff for years. There's a Discord that I hang out in, and they're all really fun guys. And to my mind, they're some of the best amateur video game historians I've ever met, because their subject matter is so obscure and weird that they can't help but get deep into it because no one else is doing it. So it's a lot of fun. Anyway, here's your takeaways from me. The NES library isn't just some cartridges you can buy. If you think that, you're boring. If you're a retronaut like me, if you like exploring, there's still a lot of undiscovered territory. Seriously, I discovered Snoop for the NES the day before I flew out here. And sometimes preserving history is really hard, so maybe you should maybe donate to my nonprofits and figure stuff out. So thank you very much for coming out, and we I left us a ton of time for Q&A, so let's go. Yes, sir.
Talk about your airplane flight. Did your plane have one of those systems with the embedded games in the headrest of the seat in front of you?
So the question was about my airplane flight. Have I been on an airplane with embedded games in them? Not. There was an NES-based one. It was official, but.
Is that an example of doing this?
No, I've never seen. Okay, yeah, that's a good question. No, I've never seen an embedded in-flight entertainment system that used a version of the Famicom, because they're usually, at least nowadays, connected to a broader entertainment system that does movies and things like that. So no, I haven't, but I wouldn't be surprised if some international airline I've never been on might have used this tech. That's a really good question, though. Yes, sir.
Does this mean that Soldier Boy's endeavors into game development are legitimate?
Okay, the question was, does this mean that Soldier Games' endeavors into game development are legitimate? No, it does not mean that. Do you guys know what he's talking about? Yeah. So, Soldier Games console, as far as I could tell, is it's a known thing that you could have purchased from AliExpress, and no, it had, actual bootleg software on it as opposed to bootleg software meaning unofficial. That literally had Nintendo published, created software on it. So I believe he's pulled them all from sale. Is that right? Yeah. I never got one. It's sad. Yes, ma'am.
When you say NES patents and whatnot, did the Super Nintendo patents also expire? Are people ripping from that too, or was it just the original?
So the question was about patent expirations. Specifically, has the Super Nintendo have Super Nintendo hardware patents expired? I believe they have, but it was never the reason you don't see Super Nintendo based plug-in plays is because. The only reason you saw the Famicom-based ones is because they were cloning the system in its prime, because they were making the system for countries that didn't have it and, cleaning up. That wasn't really so much of a situation with the Super Nintendo. There are some Super Nintendo clones, though. I believe there's some cartridge-based ones even for N64 or something that just have an embedded system on a chip and passes through the video on the N64. I might be wrong about that, but point being though that the NES was sort of its own unique situation where they had already been cloning it for so long that by the time this plug-and-play market emerged, you could buy an NES on a chip for a quarter, in parts cost. So that's kind of why they used it. Questions? You were both at the same time, but let's do you right here in the third row. Yeah.
Okay. I noticed in even some of the licensed games, they didn't really bother to port any of the licensed music, and it was just public domain, Ice Cream Truck shit.
Yeah.
So, do you think they didn't care, or they didn't have the license to, or what?
Okay, so the question was, how come the games didn't bother having the original music in them? You're talking about maybe Frogger, right,
sure, yeah.
Or Scramble or whatever. I don't know the answer for sure to that, but I suspect that the answer is that writing audio and software is very difficult, and these guys were probably porting these games in like a week, you know, and if it wasn't specifically like demanded by the publisher, they're probably not going to put that attention to detail in here. A lot of these ports are, you know, they're fairly poor. Like if you get the Intellivision plug and play, it's not good, you know, like it's like they understood the basic rules of the game, but not the nuance at all. So if you try to play Night Stalker on the NES, it's like, I don't know if you ever played Night Stalker, anyone, on the Intellivision? But I love that game. I love it because it's sort of a like, get out of cover, shoot the robot, get back in cover thing, but they made you so fast that nothing matters. But I suspect that's the reason. And again, you know, writing audio drivers is a lot harder than, you know, the graphics drivers and stuff like that. So I suspect that's the reason. I also maybe suspect there might be music rights issues even. I don't know. But again, like all of this is so mysterious. You know, the creation of these games, we don't know. But those guys might. At the Bootleg Games Wiki, especially in the Discord, you should go ask.
Thank you.
Yes, standing up.
So you mentioned like some of the new recent commercial releases for NES, like the more licensed ones.
Yeah.
And I've heard at least that some of those have their own manufacturing parts, like especially
Yeah.
I forget exactly the name, but like the Circle Soft releases in Japan, like can sometimes fry consoles like into the wrong one. Are there like telling, have you looked, are there like telling manufacturing similarities between these new cards coming out and like these blobs of epoxy that are on the system launch?
Okay, so basically the question is, so some of these new releases might catch your console on fire or kill you or whatever, and essentially the question was, is there a sort of like hardware similarity between these and the more like bootleggy epoxy ROM stuff? Was that the question? So actually, the sort of commercial video game industry releases, the things from Capcom and Data East and Retrobit or whatever and stuff like that, they're actually taking from the homebrew community. So these are actually the same manufacturers who are making unofficial NES games are also manufacturing the official ones. The names of the manufacturers, like, they're not coming to mind right now, but like that's where all the parts come from. And I think a lot of the sort of, you know, like that Street Fighter 2 release where there was a lot of headlines about how it might catch your system on fire. I think it was, you know, a lawyer made them put that in, sort of thing. And yeah, I don't. Your system's not going to catch on fire playing a game, I promise. Okay, yes, you.
Where do multi-carts fit into this?
Okay, the question is, where do multi-carts fit in? So in the old days, multi-carts for the NES or the Famicom are typically filled with actual pirated software, right? But actually a lot of these like original games, especially the sort of like, the stuff I didn't really talk about so much, like the very crappy mini games that you get like 100 of in a plug and play, a lot of those did end up on multi-carts sort of officially. And actually, if we tend to have ROM dumps of anything that's on these plug and plays, it's because they actually ended up in a cart later, so people got the ROMs off of them. But yeah, I mean, like, it's kind of, I'm trying to think if there's a more interesting way of answering that other than like multi-carts were always around, and sometimes they also use these games. I mean, I think there's a lot of software developer synchronicity, right? I think a lot of people who maybe wrote the menus for pirate multi-carts were also making quote-unquote legitimate games that they could sell in America. So I think that's probably the closest I can get to answering that question. Yes.
So you said Bunny Boy dumped that ROM and said never do it again.
Yeah.
What was the one that he dumped?
Oh, okay. The question was what ROMs was Bunny Boy attempting to dump? That was one of the Intellivision systems. I'm not sure which one. I don't know that he like actually dumped all of it, or if he's just messing around because he does that. But I believe that he was messing around with Intellivision stuff to see if he could get it to work on cartridges, to then contact Keith at Intellivision and try to work out a deal. You know, where it's like he could publish Intellivision on the NES. I believe is what he was doing. I'm not sure exactly which Intellivision one that was, but that's what he was. That's why he was dumping that. Yes, in the front.
Are there any examples, like higher profile examples of an old dev that made a game back in the day, and new tools and new hardware, and that figure kind of coming back and working in the new environment to come out with a new game?
Okay, so the question, really good question, is are there examples of developers from the old days sort of coming back to platforms that they worked on before using these new tools, right? In the world of NES, I don't know of any. Actually, that's not true. I think that some graphics artists have sort of been hired to do some work on some of the homebrews who had worked back in the day. But there's a really interesting plug and play that I didn't put in here. And it only came out in France. And it came out in 2001, which is like way before any of the other ones. And it was, this guy in France was commissioned to write software for this tech because the manufacturer wanted to do things. And he's like, why would anyone want an NES? He had written Commodore 64 games in the early 80s. And he wrote a Commodore 64 emulator for the NES to port his games over, and it shipped, and like we have it. I just couldn't get video capture in time, but like, and it's not like a developer of real note. Is Colosoft was the name of the developer, and I don't even remember the name of the games honestly, but that's sort of a similar interesting situation where like a dev from the old days who knew 6502 like ported his games forward. I think my favorite industry story of a developer getting into old tech, though, is still Ed Freeze retiring from Microsoft and making Halo 2600. Like he's just, you know, he's retired, and so he's looking at the Atari going, oh, this is really fun, and so I'm going to make a game. It's like, what do I know? I know Halo. That's what he made. But yeah, yes?
Following up with the Commodore emulator?
Yeah.
Software that was used on Jerry Ellsworth's like C64 stick that came out in the 2000s?
So the question was that Commodore 64 emulator, is that what was used on Jerry Ellsworth's designed Commodore 64 plug and play? No, she completely refactored the Commodore 64. That is completely compatible. It's not an emulator at all. It is a Commodore 64, just kind of condensed into, I don't know if it's one chip, but you know, fewer chips. No, that one wasn't NES-based at all. I actually went through most of the licensed, like sort of officially NES-based ones that I know of anyway. But yeah, no software emulation involved there. But also, his software emulator, it's not like you just plug in the game and it works. It's more like he was emulating the C64 to like save him time with things like tile placement and movement and stuff like that. He still had to, you know, rewrite the sound drivers and everything. Way in the back, yeah.
Are there any like homebrew games that are showing up in this ecosystem that have Aladdin or something like that?
Okay, question was, are there homebrew games that are now showing up in the embedded systems? Actually, yeah. The Go Retro has a handful of games written by, I forget his name, it's embarrassing. I think it's Shiru, who is, I believe, a Russian software developer. He licensed a lot of his homebrew to this system. So Zooming Secretary, if you know that, is on this. Oh, that game I can't remember the name of because it's a word that's not an English word, but it's a game where you throw sticks at like sticks to try to like break them apart, and it's actually a port of a Soviet era arcade game that's not emulated or anything. That's in here too. So yeah, there are examples of homebrew starting to creep into these for sure. And in fact, you know, I only showed this one because it's actually an NES embedded system, but if you were to expand your scope to talk about systems that are emulating the NES, then you see even more homebrew software starting to be like embedded in these systems. You also see things like, there's a company called Pico that goes and licenses NES games for some reason. Maybe it's working out for them, I hope it is. But so you see things like random NES games in these things, like Caveman Ninja, you know, like Rescue the Embassy Mission. It turns up in these things. Yeah. Did I see? Was that a yawn or a Heidi? Was that a yawn or a hand raise?
Just Gretchen.
Okay. You.
What's your opinion on the actual emulation quality of the Go Retro Portable?
What's my opinion on the emulation quality on the Go Retro Portable? There is no emulation in the Go Retro Portable. That is a Famicom and a screen. So the question would be more like, what is my opinion of the NES on a chip? No one's gotten it completely right yet. The audio tends to be a little bit off on almost all of these. I would bet that if you tried to pipe Castlevania 3 into this, it would break, because that game breaks on most of these. Not the system wouldn't break. I mean, it would not boot. But I mean, my opinion is it's good enough for a toy. Does that make sense? It's like this isn't a replacement NES or anything like that. It's a toy. It's not, well, no, it's not like a Restaurant 5. Restaurant 5 was actually software emulation. What's that?
It's not the NT one.
It's not the NT Mini. No, the NT Mini is hardware-based emulation, so it's a different approach than software-based. Or this, which is an embedded system that is a clone of the original Famicom. All kinds of ways to run these Famicom games now. Yes. Sorry, you're next.
It's a bit of a different subject, but sometimes you see these like bargain basement kind of things like that, like Sega Genesis or something like that. And it's got like, now there are like 30 games on it. And I was just wondering, the audio comes out kind of wrong. And I was just wondering, do they use any of that hardware when they're repurposing for these third-party items that come out?
Okay, so the question was about sort of other plug-and-plays based on classic systems, like a Sega Genesis plug-and-play might have a bunch of games built into it, and you notice that the audio is off, because it always is on Sega Genesis stuff. What was the actual question?
Are they using like some of the same hardware? Or what
Are they using some of the same hardware as the original?
Yeah.
Okay. Same situation for stuff like Sega Genesis. Like sometimes you see sort of a cloned system on these things, but most of the time what you're seeing is software emulation. Like especially now, I don't think there's any viable like cloned Mega Drive anymore. I think it's all software-based emulation, and the reason that the audio is wrong is because audio is really hard. that's actually the reason. I mean, it's only as good as it is as the emulator inside of it, right? And there's only so many emulator devs who care enough about audio to like put in that really thankless work to get it actually right. And then there's only so many of those emulators that the industry can completely steal to put in these systems, and that's basically the answer to that. Yeah. Up front, yes.
I know the business plays into a lot, but in your opinion, like, is this a pattern we're likely to see moving forward, where like an older piece of hardware is a good like outside whatever the big market is, like development there to kind of keep making new hardware? Because the same way like NASA uses like hardened PS1 hardware for some of their computing needs, is there like a inherent reason this hardware is what people are using, or is it more effective?
Gotcha. Yeah. So the question basically, correct me if I'm wrong, is do I see this pattern maybe happening with other like game-based hardware being like cloned and manufactured like this? I would say no. I would say that the NES was its own unique situation where like again, all those factors just kind of spilled into each other, right? Where the system itself was being cloned, you know, in its day, because that system had a really long lifespan. You know, like if you consider Famicom to the end of the NES, we're talking like 12 years. And so, and even in '83 when it launched, it was using mostly off-the-shelf parts, right? Like it was still a cheap console. So the fact that China had been cloning the console for so long is what made it such a popular system for these toys. Again, because it was just cheap. You know, it was so mature as a tech, the NES on a chip, that it was literally pennies, you know, to buy that chip and put it in a system, and that's why it kept happening. But in terms of like other video game systems, you know, I think that software-based emulation is probably the more likely approach for running software meant for those systems. I can't see someone like hardware cloning a PlayStation 3 or something. I just can't see that happening. When software emulation is going to be a much more valid approach, more likely approach, I should say. Yeah, mature. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Tagging on the previous question here. So, I mean, my understanding also with a lot of newer consoles is that, you know, it's not simply an issue of patent expiration. For example, with the PlayStation, you know, the basic input-output system of it is copyrighted, and so that's not going to expire until long after any of us are still here. So, I think, do you have anything to add about how that might also factor into why this will happen with other systems?
So the question was, other systems like the PlayStation, the patents aren't set to expire anytime, like even maybe within our lifetimes, right?
Because it's a different type of intellectual property.
Because it's a different kind of IP for sure, yeah. And does that play into it? Maybe, but I think that even if you could legally hardware clone a PlayStation 2, I don't know that anyone would bother investing in that because, again, it's just gonna. I don't think people tend to know the difference between a completely accurate hardware-based solution and emulation, right? Like, maybe they're waking up to that now that Sony released that thing that everyone hated, but they didn't have to make it that bad. Like, you could emulate the PlayStation correctly. No, I don't. I mean, I would like those patents to expire for preservation reasons, right? Like, I would like. My dream is that there's hardware-based simulations of all that hardware for especially like academic use, so that it's always playing accurately and correctly. But no, I don't see there being a commercial industry for any other cloned hardware like this. I think that it's all going to be software emulation from here on. Yes, sir. And this is probably the final question, by the way.
So you showed us the Pokemon Yellow.
Yeah.
I know the Final Fantasy VII for the NES. What do you think is the most interesting of the quote-unquote bootlegs for the...
Okay, so the question is, what do I think is the most interesting of the quote-unquote NES bootlegs, right? Like because there's been a lot of, like I showed Pokemon for a minute, and there's things like Final Fantasy VII, there's Resident Evil. So what is the most interesting? I don't know, like I think that there's a company called, I don't know how to pronounce it, I think it's Waxing or something like that, that has done a ton of RPGs in China, and they did Final Fantasy VII, like you said. They did Phantasy Star 4, which I thought was really cool. Gosh, I don't know, like the most interesting like sort of clone of a game, nothing's really springing to mind. I think Aladdin's the most technically impressive, but like I think the games that aren't clones are maybe a little bit more interesting territory. Like Flighty Chicken is hilarious. Thank you all for coming to the talk. Appreciate it.